Okay. Hi, my name is John, and today I'm going to be giving you a lecture on an introduction to economics in debate. So, just a little bit of background on me, because I think in this case it's actually kind of important to understanding how I got here, slash, why I'm presenting this. I am not like an economics wizard or anything like that. Like, I actually struggled with economics a lot throughout my time in debate, especially economic motions, just because conceptually it wasn't like my thing. And I kind of realized in this past year that economics is in some capacity tied to like almost everything you're going to debate. So that's when I was like, okay, I need to get my act together a little bit and actually learn how to debate economic topics. And so this lecture is, I think, going to be really an introduction based on what I've learned from kind of getting better at debating economics, and it's going to give you some resources you can use to improve, because at the end of the day, no one lecture can really encompass everything in economics. There's just so much to go over, but one lecture can give you kind of an understanding of what concepts and theories you're going to need the most in world schools debate for economics, and also where to apply them. The second thing I do want to say is this is definitely an introduction to economics in debate, not like an introduction to economics as a whole. I think there's another lecture happening at some point in these 2 weeks that is just about economics broadly. And so that should be a good way to do that. But this is specifically going to be talking about what economic concepts are specifically helpful in debate, more so than anything else. So I'm not going to be going over anything super specific about like the different theories and schools of thought in economics, but I am going to be talking about where different theories and concepts apply in the debate space. So yeah, that is what we're going to be talking about today. Just a more specific overview content wise, the overarching questions that I want to talk about are first, what are economic debates really about? So that's to say, what are the core ideological clashes you're talking about in economic debates? Because I think most often it's not just about, like, for example, whether or not the United States should pump money into the Federal Reserve. Like, even if that's what the motion is demanding on a surface level, usually in economic debates, there's sort of a core ideological clash or philosophical clash on what the best approach is to the economy. Second question is, what key concepts do you need to know? So what are the main things that you're going to be using in debate when you're talking about economics? And I'm hoping to kind of give you a base level understanding of them to a point where you can do your own research and learn about them yourself. And then third and finally, how do you weigh in economic debates? I think this might be one of the most important things we're going to talk about, because if I'm being completely honest, like this is definitely one of the most important things in economic debates because they can get so abstract. And in addition, it might be the thing that at least I was worst at, and I think American debaters sometimes are the worst at, because like when we see an econ motion, we're like, we need to talk about GDP, like what's best for the GDP. When in reality, it's like maybe the Cato Institute cares about that, but a judge from like Denmark probably won't so much. Um, so yeah, we're going to talk about the core ideological clashes and concepts in economic debates, the key theories and concepts you need to know, and then weighing, and that's the general overview. As far as specific content goes, we're going to also talk about the concepts most frequently debated and just a general approach to economic debates, as well as the age-old question of cap good versus social good, and kind of the base level arguments for both, and then weighing in economic debates, additional resource summary at the end, yada, yada, yada. Okay, a few pre-lecture PSAs before we really get into the meat of the material. I do want to say that I think these things happen way too often, and so I just wanted to point them out before getting into anything as things that you shouldn't do. So the first is, don't tokenize low-income persons in an economics debate just to win a round. I think when we see debates about economics, we usually assume there's an argument about low-income people, and we're usually right. But the problem is that results in sometimes debaters seeing an economic motions and being very lazy about the argument and not really considering the experiences of low income persons, and in turn just tokenizing them in hopes that they'll access more impacts, and that's something you never want to do, and I think it's not worth the ballot in any circumstance. Second, though, never assume a judge's perspective on the economy. Coming from the US, US judges generally have similar perspectives on the economy overall. Like the range of perspectives within the United States from left to right is a lot smaller than the range from left to right on an international circuit. Like a judge's perspective in the United States from like Arkansas, deep South, whatever district is probably very different from like Miha's perspective on the economy. So consider those perspectives before you go into any round. And third and finally, never limit your focus to the technicalities of economics when you're debating economic motions. You're always debating the human impacts of economics more so than the technical facets of economics theories and concepts that are kind of brought up in debate rounds. So all those things out of the way, let's get into the actual content now. What are economic debates really about? This section is going to talk specifically about the ideological clashes that come up the most often in the kind of hot topics for economic debates right now that you can do research on. So first, here's a quote that I think very well summarizes how economic debates at their cores are really clashes about humanity and whether or not the economy should be prioritized over humanity as a whole. Because what's best for economic efficiency isn't always best for humanity. It's from Cornel West, who's a super interesting guy. Definitely look into his work if you get a chance. Market moralities and mentalities fueled by economic imperatives to make a profit at nearly any cost yield unprecedented levels of loneliness, isolation, and sadness. So even though something may be very good for like GDP growth or something along those lines, it's not always best for the people living in those countries. What's at the core of these debates? The core clashes that we see most often in world schools, I think, are about how to combat inequality, whether or not you should have laissez-faire economies versus interventionist economies, and then cap good versus cap bad. And those are generally things that I think are brought out in like a ton of different rounds. So these can manifest in many different main concepts. Those being like, for example, debates about currency and inflation and cryptocurrency. Are those things good for people in the developing world, for example? But also economic systems. So going back to like cap bad versus cap good. Sometimes you'll get motions that are like, this house supports the downfall of global capitalism, which we'll have a drill on at the very end of this. And those are motions that are very specifically referencing a system, but also in doing that, they're referencing an ideology behind the system. So for example, if you're debating capitalism versus socialism, the comparative is usually individuality versus collectivism at its root. Sanctions are another thing that I think gets brought up a ton in world schools debate. Using them, for example, as a means of punishment against countries that are committing human rights abuses. Regulations come up a ton. I believe on the next slide, there's a motion, this house prefers heavy government regulation to embolden unions for improving workers' rights. And those are motions that also kind of talk about the role of government, laissez-faire versus intervention. You can see the common threads in the three core clashes above in almost all of these main concepts. Something that's kind of new and I do think a little divergent is automation. I believe you're getting a lecture at some point in these 2 weeks about AI, and that we'll probably talk about this way more in depth than I can. But there's a very interesting debate about how much we should let the free market dictate efficiency. Because the problem is if we're always doing what's most efficient, then almost always AI is going to be more efficient than humans. So in turn, the end result is going to be something that may not be best for people because they won't have jobs, but it is best for the market economy. So those are the main concepts that are super hot right now. And I would highly recommend looking into those, maybe like researching one a week or something going into this season, because then you'll have a super good backing for economic knowledge as well as just general topic knowledge. So what does debating economics look like in practice? You know the core clashes now, and you know the main concepts that you'll be debating. So on the right, you can see a column of motion examples. These are, I think, the things that I debated this year. So they're pretty current, and they're a wide range of things that that show economics and how it manifests in the debate space. Just a general way to approach economic debates, though, on the left is first to humanize your impacts, never let them become too abstract, because judges really don't care about like the abstract economic theories, except for like in a very small minority of cases, I think. Like, obviously know the concepts and theories behind the motion, but don't make those the emphasis of the round, because in reality, I don't think those are the emphasis of the round. Debate the incentives, not the technicalities. So at the top, you can see a little line that says, remember, an economics debate is an incentives debate relating to scarcity. What we're debating usually is about what incentivizes the best results for the people at the core of the clashes on the last slide. So what best incentivizes people to work? What best incentivizes companies and corporations to create good working conditions for those people to work in? What best incentivizes people to get out of poverty? Or what best incentivizes governments to actually work against poverty? So all of these things are tied to incentives, regardless of what the motion is. If you're debating the incentives, you're debating the humanity, and that's something that judges love to see. And finally, remember the core clash behind these motions. So at their core, these motions are always going to be about something bigger than what we see in the writing. If you remember the core clash, you're always going to be at the heart of the motion, which is where the judges want you. What are some motion examples then? On the right, I'll just read a few. This house would eliminate the European common currency. That's a motion specifically relating, going back to those concepts about currency and inflation, things of the sort, but also banking. This house would sanction Myanmar. I think that's a super interesting motion because it ties to morality as well. Where's the morality in punishing a country with economics? Because you might harm those people more than you help them. And then this house supports the Belt and Road Initiative. There's a super good motion or debate on this at the end that I'll show you the recording of, or give you the title to access the recording of. And I think that's a great showcase of debating economic topics in a human way. All right, all these things out of the way. What key concepts do you need to know? So we've been over the core clashes, we've been over the hot topics. Now, what are the economic theories that can really give you a leg up on people when you're debating those motions, when you're approaching these motions? And I think these are all things that like have way more depth to them than I could ever go into. So please do, if you have a chance, look into them more in depth. But they can be super useful for understanding economics in debate and justifying your cases, your models, your refutation, etc. So what are these? I think some foundational topics are, for example, modern monetary theory, which we'll talk about in a second, globalization theory, whether or not globalization is a good thing or bad thing, philosophies on alleviating and preventing recession, because that's a big R word that's tossed around as an impact in a ton of rounds. And then lastly, we're going to give some individual attention to cap good versus social good, give you an introductory kind of philosophy behind both and the foundations for arguing both. So first, on modern monetary theory. This is, I think, useful in debate rounds because you can stop your opponents from fear-mongering about debt, and you can also make very valid arguments for funding your model, specifically on progressive motions, talking about things like welfare, talking about things like Medicare for all. All of these things, it's very important to understand modern monetary theory if you want to argue against kind of the economic fear-mongering you get from more right-leaning sides of the motion. So modern monetary theory basically says debt is denominated in your own currency, so it can't be defaulted on. It emphasizes public control and says that the government has a monopoly on currency at its core. So it says because the government has control over this currency, you can't default on debt within it. You can just print more money basically and pay it off. Now, the big concern and the reason that this theory is so controversial is because if you print more money, then what's going to happen inevitably is you are going to get inflation. You're going to get tons of problems with debt, even in some cases, because that debt, when you have inflation, is going to relatively go up even after you make a payment on it. So what modern monetary theory says is that this inflation can then be restricted with taxation. So even if you do get it, by taxing private companies, you can prevent spending and as a result, inflation. Because if, let's just say, I'm pumping money into the economy and just printing it out, and you're the United States, then you can then say, okay, all these corporations that are getting this money because people are spending in the economy and it's being pumped into there are then going to have to pay excessive amounts of taxes to the government. And you can raise taxes in order to control this. When the money is in the government's hands, it doesn't really matter how much of it there is because the government has that monopoly on currency. So it won't go back out into the marketplace and they can kind of trim down on inflation as a result. Now, this is like a super surface level introduction to it. There's so much more to it, and there's definitely an argument against it. But this is something you can use to justify your progressive models. Things that go very well with this are things like progressive taxation models that go up with like income quartile. Um, and as a result, you can get away with um, I think more stuff generally within your models. You can tack on stuff without worrying about people being like, but the debt's going to get bad. One thing I will say though is I would never recommend just name dropping modern monetary theory. In fact, I would probably never say the name. I would just explain the logic behind it to a judge if it's becoming a contentious point, like funding's becoming a contentious point in the round and debt. So those are things that are pretty interesting to look into. Obviously, don't be like, we can print infinite money and like build a bridge to the moon because our side has fiat. But they are good incentives and factors to analyze when you're talking about progressive models. Next is globalization theory. And this is something that I see happening tons, especially in motions that are kind of at the intersection of international relations and economics. So globalization theory basically says the world is naturally becoming more interdependent. Like we have the internet, but at a macro level, we also have super internationalized trade. And because of that, it says there are some pros. Those pros are like specialization. Like for example, in the United States, doesn't have to produce everything because it's not its own independent economy. It can focus on what it's really good at producing. So let's just say like because the United States doesn't have to produce like stuff like renewable coal because Germany's mining that and they're specializing in that. Now the US can direct like a ton more money into Wisconsin producing a bunch of cheese because that's what we're really good at. So this allows economies and individual national entities to specialize and produce their own goods, which they're really good at. This leads to boosted innovation, and also the increased international investment leads to benefits for the developing world. There are definitely cons though, and the globalization theory basically says it decreases the power of national governments as a result because everything's so interdependent. You can't take one thing away if you're specialized in a completely different thing. So you have to rely on other countries. And as a result, it creates unmanageably large economies. So an analysis you'll hear sometimes is like the economy is walking the government on a leash rather than the government having the economy on a leash and controlling it. The applications of this, I think pretty clearly are defending or rejecting like isolationist policy or like austerity measures, things like that. Because if you want to argue against interdependence or for interdependence, you have to kind of understand the role of globalization within that and the pros and cons of both. So globalization theory is super interesting to look into, comes up a ton in debate, especially on IR/econ motions. Third and finally is alleviating and preventing recession. So there are a couple different philosophies on this, and recession is something you hear a ton about. And this is mainly tied to like laissez-faire versus interventionist economic policy. I think those are the motions where you're going to see this the most often. Okay, so Keynesian philosophy, which is a big school of thought in economics, basically says that because the cause of recessions and things of the sort is external, government intervention in times of recession is necessary because the public is going to be spending rationally in order to avoid poor impacts to like their own investments and things of the sort, their own assets. So because the public spends irrationally, the government has to step in with things like stimulus packages to get the economy going and in turn to make the economy more rational and to actually pump money into it to get it going. Now, Austrian philosophy kind of diverges from this in that it says that the cause is not external. The cause is not like resource shortage or something when it comes to recession. It says the cause of recession is poor government policy. So the best way to avoid recession is to keep governments and markets are completely free from government intervention. This means that stimulus, for example, would lead to excessive interest rates, which down the line could lead to a recession. Like in 2001, the Austrian school of thought would say, okay, there was like the dot-com bust, which we had a stimulus package in order to kind of refinance the economy a little bit. And that just delayed the big crash until like 2008, 2009. with the housing market crisis. So it basically says any amount of government intervention is going to be harmful to the economy. The economy is most efficient when it operates independently. And so even in times of recession, the best way to allow the economy to recover is to go completely hands off, because then you're not going to have like high interest rates and things of the sort. So this can justify your side's stability for the economy, whether you're arguing from an interventionist perspective or a laissez-faire perspective, which means that you can kind of apply this to any motion where it's a question of government action in the economy. Things like, I think, stimulus packages that might be debated in times of like crisis, like if you were debating the COVID stimulus package ever, or like UBI even in some ways, would allow you to have these schools of thought to kind of pull from philosophically. Now, once again, just like with modern monetary theory, you're not going to be like, well, the Keynesian school of thought does this, but the Austrian school of thought says this. Rather, you're going to explain the logic behind it and then apply that to your links. And these can be super helpful for that. So just in summary, you can see on the left kind of points on all of these and where they apply in the round. Modern monetary theory gives you more freedom to fund your advocacy. Globalization theory lets you argue for or against isolationist economic policy. And theories about recession and alleviating it justifies your model for economic stability, whether that's laissez-faire or interventionist economic policy. Okay, we're going to take a few minutes for break time. And I've listed some things you can do if you would like there. And when you come back, we're going to talk about weighing and economic debates, as well as just briefly why the economy is always going to be intersectional in that weighing. Okay, that has been pretty much 5 minutes. So I hope you had a good break. Now we're going to talk about kind of the last piece of the last section, which is cap good versus soc good, just those base arguments, and then obviously the stuff I read at the bottom there before. Okay, so capitalism versus socialism. What's the case for each? Now, I'm gonna make a disclaimer and say I'm going to like move pretty quickly through this. These have like deep kind of ideological roots as well as theoretical roots. So there's tons to go into. I think like there's super interesting cases for both. And these are just going to give you like the standard arguments that you're going to see the most often. So you have a basis to construct a case for them. And even though you may not get a motion that's specifically like this house regrets capitalism or something, you are going to see, I think, in a lot of cases, motions that indirectly reference either philosophy, whether that be workers like taking over production and like democratized workplaces, or whether that be just arguments about like economic efficiency and like automation completely hands off. So yeah, those are the things we're going to talk about just really quickly. And I think capitalism probably has the most obvious arguments for us just because we're from a place where capitalism is the system. And I say obvious, not in the sense that they're better, but in the sense that they are more apparent, I think, immediately. So for capitalism, the easy like incentives to stick with it are, first of all, there's no change required. So in any motion where you're addressing like the United States or a place that doesn't already have a socialist or like democratic socialist system that is saying you want to make that change to one, requires some kind of change. And there's risk associated with any change. And that's kind of the weighing, especially because you have to put a lot of trust in the implementation of it. And there's not a ton of great actors to do it. That we know of today. And there are certainly ways to get that implementation, but with capitalism, you don't risk it and you keep the status quo. Now, there's also an individual sense of accountability in capitalism. There's self-determination. There's a belief that individualism is the most efficient way to kind of help the economy because people make rational choices that benefit themselves. And this means that you can have some degree of meritocracy. Now, there are tons of arguments against that. I think the belief that there's a meritocracy in capitalist systems is very odd because, like, for example, 25, I think it's like if you're born into a given socioeconomic quartile, so 25%, you are going to stay within that 25% like 90% of the time. So it's like if it's really all about individualism, then why in the world wouldn't people in the bottom quartile just like make the choices to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and go up to that top quartile? But the ideology behind capitalism says that a world where they can make that choice is better because people's choices give them the liberty to progress, and it's a meritocracy in that sense. So in capitalism, you prioritize individual liberty, you don't require change, and in turn, you get greater market efficiency because there's like less bureaucracy with like that you would like get, for example, with like a democratized workplace or like government involvement in the economy. Now, socialism says that if you want a better economic system, you should restore workers' rights because then they can participate in the economy more and they're working in better conditions. So productivity is going to be better as well. You also get to reduce social turmoil and inequality as a result. And you democratize production. So you give people, in a sense, more autonomy because even though in capitalism, sure, you might like get more choice with like products, like, is that really choice? Because it's being controlled by corporations for the most part, not by like workers, for example. So when you democratize production, you give people workers or you give workers a say in how their organization participates in the economy. This means there's less coercion as well because with capitalism, you talk about how there's greater choice because there's competition in the market, so people can choose the better product. Now, there may be less products to choose from in socialism when you have more involvement in the economy. However, the reality behind this is that there wasn't really a choice in capitalism to begin with. because it's dominated by corporations that have kind of the bottom lines that they can use to control consumers and in addition control workers. So socialism liberates people by making it explicit that the choices are on some level restricted by the economic system, but telling them that that's a good thing in this case because indirectly they get more control through democratization and they're not being lied to about having that choice to pull themselves up by their bootstraps as they would in like a capitalist system. It's focused on equality of opportunity. So you can see on the right kind of a bit of a funny graphic, but I do think it's true to an extent. So on the left, you have socialism, which is saying, you know, this is horrible, like I need more space, but everyone's still on and everyone has an equal amount of suffering as a result. Whereas in capitalism, you have a few people at the center who are controlling the situation, who can just have all that space at the center. And as a result, it's saying because of their poor life choices, these people on the edges are falling off. So the question at the core of each system is, should everyone experience scarcity equally, or should some people have the autonomy to make choices that allow them to not suffer, and as a result have other people pushed out of the system entirely? So that's kind of the core ideological question. And it really depends on whether or not you believe individual choices actually grant people that liberty, actually grant them that ability to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And I think arguments for socialism kind of would say like structural barriers means those choices really don't apply. Like, for example, if you're a member of an underrepresented group, like the system is stacked against you, especially in countries like the United States. And in addition, it would say that like it's almost impossible to escape poverty in cases where you don't have like connections or something to like for example, like a big corporation that you can get an executive position at. So intergenerational wealth is definitely a consideration in capitalism, and it makes people believe that they're making choices that are benefiting them when really their circumstances are what benefited them. So that's kind of the core arguments for both. I'm sure there will be more lectures about this later in the week and you'll talk about it more. But that I think is the basics of how you would construct an argument for either. And there are tons of links you can access based on those. Okay, so now we're going to have a quick test of your ability to construct an argument based off of those. You can utilize any of this stuff I've talked about before or your own background knowledge. But I want you guys for Gold and Silver Lab to go to the document linked there and briefly outline a substantive briefly on the proposition side of the motion. This house supports the downfall of global capitalism. And then make a comment on one point of refutation for another person's argument from the opposition's perspective. And that's on that document there. The only difference for blue and red lab is I would also like brief framing for the blue and red lab in addition to that substantive. And then you can do the same thing for commenting that one point of refutation. So you can pause, do that, whatever you need to do, and then we'll get moving. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about is weighing in economic debates. And I've been going for a while now, so I'll be pretty brief with this. But I think weighing is actually pretty simple in these debates because it's really just about who can humanize your impacts the most. Judges don't vote for impacts that exist in the abstract, so you have to pick a stakeholder and fight for them. Bring out your impacts in your overviews or your introductions, because the earlier you start this, the better. You can magnify your impacts with things like argument extensions, but really just pick someone and actually fight for them. You need to actually be helping them with the motion and actually understand their situation. Because I think if you just like pick someone and you're like, oh, the judges might care about like X group, that I think doesn't do enough. Like you need to fully understand how your argument's going to help them, how the economic theories you're using are going to help them, and then paint the picture of how that works in their day-to-day life. Another thing you can do specifically with economic motions is point to the long term, because I think economic turmoil is uniquely difficult to recover from. If the motion is maybe about like let's just say something more minor, like I'm trying to think of a good example. Going back to that, like adult children, or like let's just say the motion is this house believes that adult children have a moral obligation to take care of their parents. That has like reversible impacts in the long term. Like an adult child could stop taking care of their parents if things went badly, let's just say. But Recognize that economic turmoil takes a long time to recover from. Savings are permanently lost. Families are permanently split apart. Businesses permanently collapse. And the economy it's not elastic enough to come back quickly. And every day where someone, for example, is out of work is a day they don't have food to put on their table for their family. That's a day where they're reliant on government programs, overburdening the government's end. And really, at the end of the day, it leads to massive amounts of human suffering that I don't think are comparable to other types of emotions. The longer the economy remains in recession or depression, the longer it takes to recover. So you can prioritize A, reversibility in your weighing, and B, long termism slash how quickly can you get out of this. So weighing that quickness and seeing which approach is going to be less gradual and have a more immediate positive effect can be super good weighing mechanisms in economic argumentation. Okay. Now, just lastly, some additional resources and a summary for you. Capital in the 21st Century is a great book kind of outlining all of these things that I've talked about here. And also The Body Economic is another great resources talking about why austerity kills, by David Stuckler and Sanjay Basu. And then lastly, that round from WSDC 2018, India versus China, super great example of all of this. I think if you guys watch it, you'll get a lot out of it. So just in summary, economic debates revolve around incentives and inequality. There's always going to be some kind of core ideological clash. Capitalist thought on one end of that ideological spectrum posits that choices alleviate suffering, while socialist thought posits that choices and circumstances are arbitrary, so everyone should suffer equally. And there are theories that fit into both of these systems as to how to best address them, whether or not government should intervene, etc. And lastly, whoever can humanize their impacts the most is going to be the team that's going to perform the best. So when you're weighing, prioritize humanity and prioritize, for example, the long term, the reversibility, because it takes a long time to recover from economic harms. Okay, that is everything I have for you. I hope you guys are loving GDS. I hope you're having a good time, and I hope you got a lot out of this lecture. Feel free to come talk to me in office hours about this. Once again, I'm not like an econ expert, but I do know like how you can apply it to debate decently well, at least. And yeah, I'm very happy to have gotten the chance to do this, and I hope you guys are happy and healthy.